The next practical puzzle I want to talk to you about is called the Discursive Dilemma. Philip Pettit came up with this, and it strikes me as a really interesting example of group irrationality. Each individual in the group can have a perfectly coherent, perfectly logical position, and yet when we try to aggregate preferences, or in this case judgments, we find out that the result seems irrational. Now here's the kind of case Pettit has in mind. We have two different propositions we're contemplating that are components of a larger, more complex proposition. So, for example, we might have a conjunctive statement, P and Q, or we might have a disjunctive statement, P or Q, or a conditional statement, if P then Q. And the idea is that these things are to be evaluated, the compounds that is, are to be evaluated, at least in part, in the case of a conditional, and with respect to disjunctions and conjunctions, completely, in terms of the truth values of the component sentences. But now this creates the possibility of some kind of irrationality. How does that work? Well, we make decisions individually about each of those component propositions, P and Q. And then we judge on that basis whether it's true that P and Q, or P or Q, or if P then Q. But now suppose we have a group of people, and each of those people is doing that. Each is evaluating those component propositions, P and Q, and making judgments about them individually, and then computing, correctly let's assume, on the basis of that, the truth values of those compounds. The or statement, the and statement, the if statement. Now, you might think, well, here's then what the group ought to do. Aggregate the judgments of people about P, aggregate the judgments of people about Q, and then figure out what that means about the overall compound proposition. But of course, we also have opinions of the people involved on the compound propositions, and so we could aggregate them as well. You might expect that those would yield the same outcome, and in many cases they do, but they don't always. It can happen that when we aggregate the component proposition judgments, we get group judgments about the individual propositions. And then we compare it to the aggregation of the group's judgment about the compound proposition, and they don't agree. How could that happen? Philip Pettit's example involves three experts. They're making judgments about P and about Q, and then about the conditional statement, if P then Q. And in his case, expert 1 holds that P and Q are both true, and judges on that basis, in part, that if P then Q is true. The second expert holds that they're both false, but holding that they're both false is willing to count the conditional proposition if P then Q true. The third expert thinks that P is true but Q is false, and so judges the conditional statement if P then Q false. Now in this example, if we look at what the aggregate judgment is, on the basis, for example, of a majority rule, we end up saying, with respect to P, 2/3 of them think it's true. Experts 1 and 3 think that P is true. So 2 out of 3 say P. What about Q? Well, in this case, 2 out of 3 deny it. Experts 2 and 3 think that Q is false. So we conclude, aggregate judgment about Q, false. Well now, if we think that P is true and Q is false, we need rationally to think that the conditional statement, if P then Q, is false. And that's what you would expect of the group judgment. But on the other hand, if we simply examine the expert opinions about if P then Q, 2 out of 3 counted true. So the consequent of all of that is that if we aggregate judgments about the conditional statement, if P then Q, we conclude that the group of experts thinks overall that it's true. And yet they think overall that P is true, they think overall that Q is false. And we get a logically incoherent set of propositions. I think it's somewhat unfortunate that that example involves conditional statements, because a conditional statement, although we often treat it in elementary logic as if it's a truth-functional sort of connective between the antecedent and the consequent, in natural language it doesn't seem to be that way. And so let's for the moment set that case aside. The same thing can happen with respect to conjunctive statements and disjunctive statements. So let's take something simpler, something that clearly is truth functional, like a disjunction, an or statement. So suppose we look on various weather channels or weather websites to find out whether we're going to have wintry precipitation tomorrow. And so we look at the first, and it says that there will be snow, but not freezing rain. Judges the statement there will be snow or freezing rain, true. We look at the second. It says, well, it's not going to snow, but there will be freezing rain. It judges the disjunctive statement, there will be snow or freezing rain, true. We go to the third weather source, and it says, no, there's not going to be snow, there's not going to be freezing rain. So it judges the disjunctive statement that there will be either snow or freezing rain, false. Now, it looks like 2 out of 3 weather sources are saying that there's going to be either snow or freezing rain, right? 2 out of 3 agree with the disjunctive statement. But how many of them think it's going to snow? Actually, only 1 of the 3. What about the other possibility of freezing rain? Only 1 of the 3 predicts freezing rain. And so actually, the collective judgment about snow is false. The collective judgment about freezing rain is false. And yet, the collective judgment about it will snow or will have freezing rain is true. So the same kind of irrationality emerges by looking at more than one weather source. It's been said, it's possible to have too much. The man with 1 watch knows what time it is. The man with 2 watches is never quite sure. And I think that's something like the point here. Go to 1 weather station, aha, we get a prediction about tomorrow's weather. Go to more than 1, and in particular, go to at least 3. And all of a sudden, we've got this possibility of irrationality emerging. Now, the same thing can be true of a conjunctive statement. Let's take that earlier example about wintry precipitation and think about the conjunctive statement. We're going to have snow and freezing rain. Where I used to live in Connecticut, this was very common. It would start snowing. It would be absolutely beautiful. And then the snow would turn to rain. It would last not long enough to actually melt the snow. The result of it would be that there would be this very wet layer on top of the snow, and then, especially after nightfall, it would freeze, and so you would get snow topped with a layer of freezing rain that formed an ice sheet on the top of the snow. Now, it was absolutely beautiful. It made the snow look utterly crystalline. However, you would step on it, your foot would go through, and then, as you tried to move out of it, it was easy to even cut your leg on the ice. Okay, so we're thinking, is that going to happen? Is it going to be freezing rain and snow? Well, again, we go to our weather sources. Source 1 says we're going to have freezing rain and we're going to have snow. They predict a combo, both, okay? Second source says we're going to get snow, but there's not going to be freezing rain. Third source says we're going to get freezing rain, but not snow. So now we take a look at those components. Is there going to be snow? 2 out of 3 say yes. Is there going to be freezing rain? 2 out of 3 say yes. So there's going to be snow and freezing rain? Actually, only 1 of the 3 agrees with that conjunctive statement. So we get a judgment aggregating these that it's going to snow, that we're going to have freezing rain, and yet it will not be true that we have snow and freezing rain. That looks irrational. It looks completely illogical. That's the discursive dilemma. Whenever we have logically complex propositions, our individual judgments can be perfectly logical, perfectly coherent, perfectly consistent internally. And yet we aggregate by, for example, majority vote about the component sentences and about the compound sentence, and there's disagreement. It looks like the collective judgment, the aggregated judgment, is irrational. It's utterly illogical, even though we have followed a reasonable procedure. Now again, you might think this is just some weird feature of majority rule. Obviously, when we evaluate sources of this kind, we better go with something other than majority rule. But it's not so simple. It is not easy to find any rational rule that's going to produce the right kind of outcome. And so it will turn out that judgment aggregation can produce irrationality. Once again, as with Condorcet's paradox, we get a very interesting kind of problem. Individual rationality combined does not guarantee group rationality. The group decisions can be utterly illogical, even though each individual in the group is completely logical.